received an MD from the University of Maryland in 1953, a long while back, and I was involved in the medical profession for several years. I interned at Charity Hospital in New Orleans, and I was in the Air Force for 2 years as a physician. When I left the Air Force, I began a residency in internal medicine in Baltimore, Maryland, which is my hometown where I grew up. But I soon decided that I wanted to do something else, and I left the medical profession voluntarily and went to graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania and took a PhD in anthropology. And so my career has been largely as a professional anthropologist, a university and college teacher of anthropology. When I came to Hampshire College as an anthropologist in 1972, I encountered a group of students there who had developed a course on the Holocaust, and they had no faculty member to work with them, and I was asked whether I would. I'd already become interested in the subject, and so I functioned as their faculty supervisor for the year while they ran this course where we had guest speakers come in. Following that, I began to teach a course on the Holocaust myself, and soon after that I decided that I should really teach this course as European Jewish history, with the Holocaust as the final part of the story. So in addition to teaching anthropology at Hampshire College in Amherst, Massachusetts, I became a teacher of European Jewish history and culture as well. Back in approximately 1995, perhaps somewhere along there, I was reading a book on European Jewish history, and I encountered a statement by Sander Gilman, who's a well-known scholar in the field. He said, "The image of the Jew in Europe was the image of the circumcised male." Now, by that time, not only had I been teaching the subject, but I had also written a book entitled Abraham's Heirs, Jews and Christians in Medieval Europe. And I had never seriously considered this subject. So after I read that, it stunned me, and I began to research the subject in depth. The more I read, the more I learned, of course, and I soon realized that circumcision was not just a Jewish practice, but that in fact circumcision is a practice in the United States, at the time practiced by somewhere around near 70% of the population. And by that time I had already become what we call an intactivist. I had become one in spirit, although maybe not in flesh yet. But I did discover No Circ and Marilyn Milos. I wrote to Marilyn, and I asked her whether I might come to speak at one of the symposia. I learned about the symposia. I knew there was going to be one in Sydney in December of the year 2000. I asked her whether I might come speak. Marilyn said she had no space for me, but I should send an abstract, and if anything opened up, she would see what she could do. So I sent her an abstract for a talk that I called Jewish Circumcision, an Historical Enigma. Marilyn said no one else had ever spoken about this subject this way, and she would like me to come. So I came to Sydney in December 2000 with Nancy, and we met the Intactivist group there, and we were warmly, enthusiastically received, and I liked people so much, and I was so interested in what was happening, that I knew from then on that I was hooked. And that's been 10 years, and I have not regretted it. So I then went on from there and continued my research that eventually led in the year 2005 to publication of my book, Marked in Your Flesh, Circumcision from Ancient Judea to Modern America. It was published by Oxford. I saw that as my contribution, a contribution to the movement. I've also done articles for symposium volumes. I've done several of those. And of course I'm going to be speaking again today, and hopefully perhaps publish at least one more. So that's been my contribution. I think of myself as a scholarly activist, or an activist scholar, call it what you will, but I think of this as my contribution to the movement, really. I also write letters. I've also stood in booths, and I've stood outside and held signs saying the foreskin is not a birth defect, and so on. I'm totally convinced, that cutting the genitals of children, infants or children, girls or boys, is fundamentally evil. And that's why I'm an intactivist. Nancy and I have 3 sons in addition to a daughter. All 3 sons were circumcised without our ever thinking twice about it. I didn't give it a first thought or a second. Later, because Nancy is not Jewish, we had the boys go through a formal conversion ceremony so that they could be bar mitzvahed. In order to do that, they had to have a ritual drawing of 1 drop of blood. Perhaps you know about this already. It's called Hatafat Dam Brit, the drawing or the shedding of blood of the covenant. I accepted that at the time. I did not like it. I have never liked bris, period. I have only been to a couple and I didn't like it. If the decision were being made now, there's absolutely no question we would never have had our sons circumcised in any form, ritually or otherwise. But at the time we were not aware, and so that was done. I consider myself, I am a Jew. The fact that I am opposed to this anachronistic, barbaric behavior has nothing to do with the fact that I am Jewish. I told my students when I taught European Jewish history, I told them in the first class, we're talking here about Jews. And I want you to use the word and to understand who we're talking about. We're talking about Jews. Children, whether male or female, of any race or ethnicity or background, have the right to their own physical integrity. No one, no parent, no adult, no one has the right to deprive a child of any part of his or her body without extreme emergency medical justification. No cultural or religious justification in my mind can serve for depriving a child of part of his or her body. The fact that the child is born to Jewish parents simply means that that child has the same right as any other child to physical integrity. When a child reaches the age of 18, whether male or female, if that mature person decides that he or she wants a part of the body altered, well, I may think of that as foolish, but that's the person's right and privilege, but not for an infant and not for a young child. So it's hard to explain how one does research because it takes place over a number of years. But basically, I think as you read, you follow everyone else's references and you extend your references more and more broadly. And gradually the whole subject comes together for you, but it takes quite a bit of time. I couldn't have done it without my wife's assistance. It was more than assistance. She was really my editor and the judge of everything I was doing and making constant suggestions for organization. The hardest part is organization, thinking about what goes into what chapter and what follows what. Generally speaking, I follow chronology. At least for the first part of the book, I favor a chronological story. Then in the later part of the book, I moved to topics and dealt with particular topics that I thought might be of special interest. For instance, the way circumcision is dealt with in the popular media, for example. Oh, I learned a great deal. I think practically everything I learned was new to me. I certainly came to understand how sexist the procedure is, particularly within Judaism and Islam. This is a procedure that is supposed to shed sacred blood of the male. We know that in many religions, including Judaism certainly, female blood is considered to be contaminating. The woman has to purify herself or certainly according to Leviticus, the woman had to purify herself after bleeding, including the blood of childbirth, of course. I certainly learned how sexist it was. I certainly learned how much it was connected with aggression. I learned also how it had evolved over time, the change over from earlier temple times to rabbinic times, and how the ritual had been interpreted and reinterpreted and justified and rejustified in various ways. I learned also how connected the idea of circumcision was with Christian fantasies about Jews. It seems sort of understandable that let's think of young Christian girls, peasant girls, coming into Jewish homes as maids and seeing this happen. Well, obviously the conclusion would come out. If they're willing to do this to their own children, what might they do to ours? And of course the fantasy about ritual murder, the idea that Jews were ritually murdering Christian boys in imitation of the crucifixion and so on, was obviously connected with circumcision. In fact, if you look in my book, there's at least one very good picture there, a woodcut, showing a ritual crucifixion. But in fact, what they're doing, they are drawing blood from the child's penis. The child's penis is very obviously being assaulted. So it was clear that what this was then was an imitation of circumcision. And the conclusion, as I said, if Jews are willing to mutilate their own babies this way, what might they be willing to do to ours? So there was an association in the Christian mind. This is something else I certainly learned. An association in the Christian mind between Jews, blood, and knives. The mohel with his sharpened knife, the animal slaughterer with his sharpened knife, and the need to remove all blood from the slaughtered animal, and so on. So there grew up in the Christian mind an association, as I say, between Jews, blood, and knives that persisted right up into our own time, and perhaps in some places still does, and it's certainly connected with the ritual murder fantasies that have been part of European Christian culture for many, many centuries, and even re-emerged in this country during the 20th century more than once. Metsitsa came in later, as far as I can tell. There were three parts to it: Milah, Priya, and Metsitsa. And Metsitsa probably came in later. Why exactly they began to do this, I don't think anyone is completely certain. It has something to do clearly with blood. Circumcision originally was a sacrificial act, and blood itself is not mentioned. Blood is not mentioned in the Torah, in the Genesis and in Leviticus. All that is mentioned is the flesh of his foreskin shall be removed. Flesh in Hebrew is basar, but it also means penis. The word basar means flesh and penis, both. But blood is not mentioned. Only later, after the destruction of the temple, when bloody temple sacrifices were no longer possible, did circumcision become the sole remaining, or the only, Jewish ritual involving blood, so that of course now blood must be drawn. The infant's penis must bleed. So obviously when the mohel did this sucking, sometimes spitting it into a cup of wine, this obviously was connected with the emphasis on blood. Now, by the 19th century, many German Jews in particular, Reform Jews, were objecting to this. And they began to develop other ways of doing this. One thing was to use a glass tube, which is still in use in some places. Use a glass tube to draw blood. Most circumcisers, my guess would be that most of the mohelim, the mohels, who do this now, do not practice Metsitsa. I think this is only practiced by the ultra-Orthodox. And of course we had a nasty case in New York City not long ago, where this led to severe illness and death for children because an infected mouth was being used to suck the penises of these helpless infants. Not a good situation. I might add that, as far as I can tell, most Jewish Americans know nothing about this. Nothing. Generally speaking, I would say the response of most Jewish readers has been sort of neutral. They haven't said much afterwards about it. Some have told me that it influenced them in the way I hoped it would. Reviews that were written by rabbis and others of that type were generally negative, saying I didn't understand the power of religion and ritual. This even though I taught courses on the anthropology of religion for many years, as well as courses on European Jewish history and so on. But I would say that overall it's been difficult for me to really know what kind of response I would get. The most enthusiastic responses have come from fellow opponents of circumcision, from intactivists. Jewish readers, some have simply responded by saying, well, you know, we're still going to do it. Others have been more friendly, and I would say the usual response, such as, to the extent that I've heard any, has been rather neutral, just, you know. Sometimes I have sent books to rabbis and others who have never even acknowledged the book. I've asked them if they would like a copy. Yes, send me a copy, and I'd like to hear your comments on the book, but I've received nothing, not even so much as a note saying thank you for sending me the book. Nothing. Oh. So I have to read that. You may read that as you like. Most reviews have not been favorable. I received one quite favorable review from an eminent Jewish scholar, Shia Cohen, who himself is the author of a book called Why Are Jewish Women Not Circumcised? And his answer, he took a whole book to say it, but the answer is, it's a sexist ritual for men. He did write a very positive review of my work. Rabbis, when they reviewed me, rabbis were negative, as I would have expected. I didn't think it was exactly fair to have them as the reviewers, but there it was. David Gulliher, the author of a good book, a good pioneering book on circumcision, wrote a negative review, saying essentially that I had said nothing new. I thought that was unfair. I've never said anything to him about that, but I thought that was unfair. I certainly depended for part of my book on his work, and I referred to him frequently. I certainly indicated where I had used his work. But to have said that I had done nothing beyond what he had done, I thought was not really a fair review. But one expects that. If you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. When you're in academia and you do a book, you have to expect that that's going to happen. And if you think that you're not going to be able to tolerate that, you shouldn't publish the book. I don't have any religious faith. I am what's called a secular Jew, or an ethnic Jew. I am a Jew by ethnic origin. I'm a Jew by birth, and will of course remain so, obviously. But I haven't had any supernatural beliefs since somewhere around age 15 or 16, when I decided that this was all nonsense. I have attended many, many synagogue services, Jewish rituals of every kind, and we conduct a Passover Seder at our home and so on. But I do this as a member of the larger Jewish community. This, to my mind, has nothing to do with faith, because, as I say, I have no faith other than in reason, rationalism, and scientific progress. I don't believe in anything whatever supernatural, nothing. I knew that I did not like circumcision well before I became an activist. One thing that stuck in my mind years before was when I learned that recordings of the screams of circumcised infants were different from other infant crying. That told me right there, sort of obvious, that something very serious was going on here. But you can't do everything in this life. We only have one. You can't do everything. And I think the people who are in that room with us are those who have chosen this as their way of expressing themselves and as their way of contributing in some small way to the betterment of human life. I think we have to focus on trying to get the United States circumcision rate down, down, down. The Jewish rate, the Jewish American rate, I think will naturally follow. Most Jewish Americans are American first. I use the term Jewish American rather than American Jews specifically to indicate that most Jewish Americans are an ethnic group. They are of Jewish background, if you want to use that term or whatever, or Jewish ethnicity, but they are Americans. And if Americans are doing this, that, or the other, most Jewish Americans will do the same thing. And if circumcision rates continue to drop in the United States, Jewish American circumcision rates will also drop. They already are. There are many Jews out there who are not accepting circumcision for their children. We think, without clear evidence, that perhaps 1 in 6 Jewish babies now, male babies, are not being circumcised, are being left intact. But that's speculation, only on the basis of personal experience, talking with people, what you know, and so on. So there are changes taking place in America, and there are changes taking place among Jewish Americans. The notion that Judaism is a religion and a culture that cannot change, that doesn't correspond to what we as anthropologists know about cultures. Cultures change. They change constantly in response to individual decision-making, to individual will. If we look at any culture anywhere, we see that although basic patterns may remain, all sorts of individual parts of the cultures change. Orthodox Jewish men now, Hasidic men, are dressing in clothing that was characteristic of the Polish gentry somewhere around the 17th century. They don't even know that. But there's nothing Jewish about the way they dress. This is purely a cultural development that took place in one part of the Jewish community that really has nothing to do with anything that you can find in biblical or even rabbinic Judaism. And the same holds for circumcision. Certainly it's been there all this time. We know it's been there, not since the time of Abraham. Abraham is a mythical character who never lived. It's been there since approximately 500 BCE, instituted by priests. That's another subject, but it was instituted by priests as a symbol of loyalty to the theocracy that they were creating. So it has been part of Jewish culture for something like 2,500 years. But it has changed over time. The procedure itself has changed over time. And certainly we know that Judaism as a religion has changed immensely over time. There's no reason why we can't get rid, at least why many of us anyway, can't get rid of this abominable custom.